Frozen winds sweep the tarmac as CEO Rachel Stone coldly fires Jack, a grease-stained mechanic dad, tearing his contract in front of a mocking crowd. As he silently packs his worn-out tools, a massive Navy Seahawk thunders from the gray horizon. The airfield's radio suddenly erupts, bypassing all protocols to bellow a secret call sign from a forgotten elite life. In that heartbeat, the entire facility freezes in shock. The man they just discarded like trash is no ordinary mechanic. He is a legend the military has been searching for, and his past has just caught up with him. Jack Miller was the kind of man you'd walk past 100 times and never truly see. At 43, his life was written in the grease under his fingernails and the subtle, permanent squint of eyes that had spent decades looking into the white-hot heart of jet engines. To the world at Stone Aero Maintenance, he was just Miller, the guy who worked the 4:00 a.m. shift, the man who spoke only when necessary, and the mechanic who was always the last to leave the hangar. But Jack didn't mind the anonymity. In fact, he cherished it. He lived for a single small reason: a 10-year-old girl named Ellie who had her mother's bright eyes and a laugh that could heal the deepest of Jack's old scars. Every morning, before the sun even dared to touch the horizon, Jack was already at his station. He worked the early shift specifically so he could be at the school gates by 3 p.m. To Ellie, he wasn't a veteran or a technician. He was just Dad, the man who made the best grilled cheese sandwiches and understood exactly why a math homework could feel like a mountain. Jack's past was a locked box. He had served his country in the shadows of the military's most elite aviation units, but he walked away from the medals and the adrenaline the moment family tragedy struck. He traded the roar of fighter jets for the quiet safety of a civilian hangar, choosing a life where the stakes weren't life and death, but rather just making ends meet. Enter Rachel Stone. At 47, Rachel was the CEO of Stone Aero Maintenance, a woman who treated people like data points on a spreadsheet. She was brilliant, fierce, and utterly convinced that speed was the only metric that mattered. Under her leadership, the company had grown 3 times over, but the atmosphere had become a pressure cooker. She implemented rigid KPIs and had no patience for exceptions. To her, Jack Miller was an anomaly, a relic of an older, slower era of maintenance. The tension between them came to a head on a rainy Tuesday. A high-priority commercial flight was scheduled for departure, but Jack had flagged a micro-vibration in the turbine casing. It was a flaw so small that most automated sensors hadn't even picked it up. Jack insisted on a full manual teardown. Rachel, seeing the delay costs mounting by the minute, was livid. She saw Jack's caution as inefficiency, a deliberate slowing down of her well-oiled machine. "Safety is a standard, Miller, not a hobby," she had barked at him in front of the crew. Jack had simply looked her in the eye and said, "If that bird goes up with that vibration, she might not come back down." The flight was delayed by 4 hours. Jack was right. A hairline fracture was discovered. But Rachel didn't care about being right. She cared about the schedule. In her mind, Jack was a liability to her bottom line. She decided then and there that his time was up. The next morning, the confrontation on the tarmac was cold and clinical. Rachel didn't call him into her office. She chose to make an example of him in front of the entire morning shift. She stood there, her clipboard a shield against the freezing wind, and handed him the termination papers. "Your services are no longer required, Jack. You're too slow for the future of this company," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. The papers were torn from the binder, the sound sharp like a gunshot in the quiet hangar. A few younger mechanics, looking to earn favor with the boss, let out a mocking laugh. Jack felt the heat rise in his chest, but he suppressed it. He thought of Ellie. He thought of the quiet life they had built. He didn't argue. He didn't bring up the fracture he'd found yesterday or the 20 years of service he had under his belt. He simply began to gather his tools. Each wrench and socket went into his old battered chest with a metallic clink that felt like a funeral bell. He was halfway through packing when he heard it, a sound he hadn't heard in years, yet one his body recognized before his brain did. It was the heavy, rhythmic thrum of twin-engine turboshaft engines. This wasn't a civilian craft. The frequency was too low, the power too immense. The air around the hangar began to ripple. The snickering managers fell silent as a dark shadow stretched across the tarmac. A Navy Seahawk, painted in the matte gray of a ghost, was banking hard toward their position. Rachel Stone frowned, looking at her clipboard. There were no military arrivals scheduled. There were no VIPs expected. But the helicopter wasn't asking for permission. It was coming down, and it was coming down fast. As the massive blades began to kick up a hurricane of dust and debris, Jack Miller stopped. He stood over his toolbox, his head slowly tilting toward the sky. The man who was too slow for the corporate world suddenly looked like the only person on the tarmac who wasn't afraid. The downwash from the Seahawks' rotors was punishing. It whipped Rachel's expensive coat around her knees and sent the termination papers, the ones she had just handed to Jack, tumbling across the oil-stained concrete like fallen leaves. She shielded her eyes with her hand, her frustration mounting. This was a violation of airspace, a disruption of her carefully timed operations. She looked around for her security team, ready to demand an explanation, but even the toughest guards stood paralyzed. Beside her, the junior managers who had been snickering moments ago were now scrambling to hold on to their caps. The mocking laughter had vanished, replaced by a primal sense of awe. You don't realize how large a military machine is until it's hovering 30 feet above your head, vibrating the very marrow in your bones. Jack Miller, however, didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his hand resting on the handle of his heavy toolbox. While everyone else was cowering or squinting against the dust, Jack was watching the aircraft with the critical eye of a surgeon. He noted the angle of the flare, the subtle correction the pilot made against the crosswind, and the specific whine of the hydraulics as the landing gear took the weight. For a man who had just been fired for being obsolete, he looked more at home in this chaos than anyone else on the field. The Seahawk touched down with a precision that was terrifying to behold. As the rotors began to cycle down to a low, rhythmic thrum, the side door slid open. A Navy officer, wearing a flight suit and carrying a helmet, stepped out. He didn't look at the hangar. He didn't look at the expensive corporate jets lined up like toys. He scanned the crowd with a singular focus. Rachel Stone, regaining some of her composure, stepped forward. She was used to being the most important person in any room, on any tarmac. She cleared her throat, adjusting her coat. "I am Rachel Stone, CEO of this facility," she began, her voice trying to compete with the dying roar of the engines. "We weren't notified of a military landing. If this is an emergency fuel stop, I'll need to see—" The officer didn't even look at her. He didn't even slow down. He walked right past her as if she were a ghost. Rachel froze, her mouth still open. The humiliation was sudden and sharp. In front of her entire staff, she had been ignored by a man who looked like he came from a world where CEOs and KPIs meant absolutely nothing. She turned, her face flushing a deep crimson. "Excuse me, I am speaking to you." At that moment, the base's external PA system, the one usually reserved for weather warnings and shift changes, erupted with a screech of feedback. Then a voice came through. It wasn't the local dispatcher. It was a high-priority military broadcast, patched through via satellite. "Contact established at Sector 7G, the voice boomed, echoing off the hangar walls. "Requesting immediate visual on Aegis One. Repeat, requesting Aegis One." The name hit the air like a physical weight. Rachel looked at her digital clipboard, frantically scrolling through her employee list. Miller, Jack, Smith, Robert, Thompson, David. There was no Aegis on her payroll. She turned to her head of security. "Who is that? Is there a VIP in the terminal?" The security chief shook his head, his eyes wide. "Ma'am, look at the radio." The handheld units on the belts of every mechanic on the tarmac were blinking red. A priority override. The officer who had stepped off the helicopter reached for his own shoulder-mounted radio and keyed the mic. His voice was calm, but the urgency was undeniable. "Tarmac is secure. I have eyes on the asset. Initiating contact now." The officer stopped exactly 6 feet in front of Jack Miller. He didn't look at the oil-stained jumpsuit. He didn't look at the termination notice lying in the dirt near Jack's boots. He snapped to a crisp, perfect military salute. "Sir," the officer said, his voice ringing out in the sudden silence of the airfield, "the fleet commander sends his regards. We have a situation red on a carrier-bound transport 300 miles out." The automated diagnostics are failing. The brass says there's only one man left who can talk an engine through a catastrophic surge without seeing it. Jack Miller looked at the officer. The tired, humble, mechanic dad persona seemed to peel away in layers. His shoulders squared. His gaze sharpened. The man who had spent the last 5 years trying to be invisible was suddenly the brightest thing on the tarmac. Aegis One, the officer repeated, his voice dropping to a respectful tone. We need you back. The name was called, sir. Will you answer? Rachel Stone felt the world tilt. She looked at Jack, the man she had called slow, the man she had ridiculed for wasting time on safety checks, the man she had just discarded like a piece of broken equipment. Her staff was watching. The snickering managers were now white-faced and trembling. Jack looked down at his toolbox. He thought of Ellie. He thought of the quiet life he had tried to build to keep her safe from the world he once inhabited. But he also heard the specific engine code mentioned over the officer's radio. He knew that engine. He had helped design the cooling shroud for it 10 years ago. If it was surging, 3 pilots were currently sitting on a ticking time bomb. He looked back at the officer. He didn't ask about pay. He didn't ask about his status. He simply asked one question. Is it the XJ90 series? The officer nodded grimly. Yes, sir. Port side. Total sensor blackout. Jack reached down and closed the lid of his toolbox with a heavy, final thud. He didn't look at Rachel Stone. He didn't look at the termination papers. He looked at the officer and said, Get the patches ready. I need a direct line to the carrier's maintenance deck, and I need it 30 seconds ago. The freeze-frame moment was total. Rachel Stone stood in the dust, her power evaporated, watching as the man she had just fired was escorted toward the most advanced piece of machinery on the field, with more respect than she had ever received in her entire career. The mechanic dad was gone. Aegis One had returned. The officer, a lieutenant commander by the name of Vance, handed Jack a high-encryption headset. As Jack slid it over his ears, the transition was complete. He was no longer the man who worried about 3:01 p.m. school pickups. He was a master of thermodynamics and chaos. Patch me into the pilot's cockpit and the deck chief on the USS Enterprise, Jack commanded. His voice had lost its soft, fatherly edge. It was now cold, surgical, and absolute. Rachel Stone stepped forward, her face a mask of desperate confusion. Wait, this is my tarmac. You can't just take my former employee, and conduct military business without... Vance turned his head just an inch, his gaze chilling. Ma'am, the man you just fired is the chief warrant officer who wrote the troubleshooting manual for every turbine engine in the Navy's current fleet. He has a level 1 security clearance that supersedes your entire company's existence. If you interfere again, I will have you detained under the National Defense Act. Am I clear? The silence that followed was deafening. The junior managers who had laughed at Jack were now trying to shrink into their boots. Rachel fell back, her legs feeling like lead. She watched as Jack ignored her entirely, his eyes closed as he listened to the roar of a jet engine 300 miles away through his headset. He's surging at 4,000 RPMs, Jack said to the headset, his voice calm. The automated bleed valves are sticking because the heat sink is misaligned. Don't trust the digital readout. It's ghosting. Tell the pilot to manual dump the secondary fuel line and cycle the air intake to 60%. Do it now, or the turbine blades will shatter in 60 seconds. For a full minute, the tarmac was a cathedral of tension. Everyone held their breath. Then a voice crackled through the Seahawk's external speakers. A joyful, relieved shout from the carrier's deck chief. Aegis One, we have stabilization. Surging has stopped. Pressure is normalizing. You just saved 3 lives and a $60 million bird, sir. Jack didn't celebrate. He just exhaled softly, the weight of the moment leaving his shoulders. He handed the headset back to Vance. That was the first twist, a voice whispered from the crowd. It was one of the senior mechanics who had always respected Jack. He looked at Rachel Stone, who was now trembling. You didn't just fire a mechanic, Rachel. You fired the guy who designed the very engines you charged millions to fix. But the second twist was coming, and it was far more personal. Rachel, seeing her reputation crumbling, tried one last desperate move to regain control. She stepped toward Jack as he moved to pick up his toolbox. Jack, I... I didn't know. If you had just told me your rank, your history, we could have worked something out. I'll double your salary. I'll make you head of operations. Just don't leave like this. Jack stopped. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, Rachel saw the true depth of the man. It wasn't anger in his eyes. It was pity. You think I kept my name a secret because I was ashamed, Rachel? Jack asked quietly. I kept it a secret because of my daughter. When my wife died in a service-related accident, I realized that medals and titles don't tuck a child into bed at night. I wanted a life where the only thing that mattered was being a dad. I wanted a job where I could be slow and careful, because in my world, slow means nobody dies. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. You fired me because I flagged a vibration. You told me safety was a hobby. But here's the second thing you didn't know. The Navy didn't just come for my help today. They've been monitoring the safety records of civilian contractors for months. Your company has the highest efficiency rating in the state, but the lowest safety to repair ratio. Lieutenant Commander Vance? Vance stepped forward, pulling a folder from his flight suit. Ma'am, as of 0 hours this morning, Stone Arrow Maintenance is under federal audit. All military and government contracts are suspended pending a full investigation into your speed over safety protocols. Aegis One flagged your discrepancies weeks ago, long before you handed him those papers. Rachel felt the air leave her lungs. She had tried to humiliate a man to protect her bottom line, only to realize that the man she targeted was the one holding the scale of justice. Jack hadn't stayed quiet because he was weak. He had stayed quiet because he was observing. You called me slow, Rachel, Jack said, his hand finally gripping the handle of his toolbox. But you're the one who didn't see this coming. He looked at his watch. It was 2:45 p.m. Lieutenant Commander, can your bird get me to Ellie's school by 3 hours? Vance smiled, the first genuine smile seen on the tarmac all day. Sir, for Aegis One, we'll have you there in 5 minutes. We'll even land on the playground if you want. The parking lot will do, Jack said with a small grin. As Jack walked toward the Seahawk, the entire crew of Stone Arrow Maintenance, hundreds of mechanics, janitors, and engineers, began to clap. It wasn't a loud corporate cheer. It was a rhythmic, soulful sound of respect. They watched as the man they had known as Miller climbed into the belly of the beast. Rachel Stone stood alone in the center of the tarmac, clutching a digital clipboard that was now completely worthless. The winds grew stronger as the Seahawk prepared for takeoff, blowing the dust of the airfield over her expensive coat. She looked down at the ground and saw the termination papers again, now soaked in oil and footprints. The helicopter rose, tilting its nose toward the horizon, where a little girl was waiting for her dad. Rachel watched until it was just a speck in the gray sky, finally realizing that she hadn't just fired a mechanic. She had unwittingly driven away the only person who could have saved her own empire. The roar of the departing Seahawk left a hollow ringing in the ears of everyone remaining on the tarmac. For several long minutes, no one moved. They all stared at the empty space in the sky. Then slowly, almost as if orchestrated by a silent conductor, every pair of eyes turned toward Rachel Stone. The silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of submission or the silence of busy work. It was the heavy, judging silence of a workforce that had just seen their leader's soul laid bare and found it wanting. Rachel stood frozen, her designer boots scuffed by the very dust Jack Miller had spent years cleaning. Her hands were trembling so violently that the digital clipboard slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the concrete. No one stepped forward to pick it up. Back to work, she whispered, her voice cracking. Everyone, back to your stations. We have a schedule to keep. But no one moved. A senior mechanic named Sarah, who had worked for Stone for 15 years, stepped forward. She wiped her grease-stained hands on a rag and looked Rachel dead in the eye. The schedule? You just heard the commander, Rachel. Our contracts are suspended. There is no schedule. There's only the truth. I can fix this, Rachel stammered, her eyes darting around. I'll call the board. I'll explain that Miller was an outlier, a A misunderstanding. He wasn't an outlier, Sarah said, her voice rising so everyone could hear. He was the only one of us brave enough to tell you that your efficiency was going to kill someone. We all saw the fracture in that turbine yesterday. We all knew he was right, but we were too afraid for our jobs to say anything. You didn't just fire Jack Miller today, you fired our conscience. One by one, the other mechanics began to set down their tools. It wasn't a violent strike. It was a quiet, collective refusal to continue living under the lie. The junior managers who had snickered at Jack earlier now looked like cornered animals, realizing that their proximity to Rachel was now a liability. Meanwhile, 300 miles away, the power was shifting in a different way. Inside the Seahawk, Jack Miller sat in a jump seat, the vibration of the craft familiar and comforting. He wasn't thinking about the audit or the fall of Stone Arrow maintenance. He was looking at a crumpled drawing Ellie had made for him, which he kept in the breast pocket of his jumpsuit. "Sir," Vance's voice came over the internal comms. "The Admiral just messaged. He's personally overseeing the transition of the Stone contracts. He wants to know if you'd consider taking an advisory role. You wouldn't have to leave your home. You'd be the final word on every safety protocol in the private sector." Jack looked out the window as the school building came into view. "I have one condition, Commander." "Anything, sir?" "Hey, every parent in that facility gets a flexible schedule," Jack said firmly. "No one should ever have to choose between keeping a plane in the air and being there when their kid walks out of those school doors. And no mechanic ever gets fired for saying, 'Wait, this isn't safe.'" Vance nodded, his expression solemn. "Consider it done. The Miller Protocol will be the new industry standard." Back at the hangar, the atmosphere had reached a breaking point. Rachel was shouting now, a desperate shrill sound, as she tried to command a room that no longer recognized her authority. Federal agents and windbreakers were already arriving at the perimeter, beginning the long process of seizing the logs and the data she had tried to manipulate. Rachel looked out at her empire and realized it was a cage of her own making. She had built a world of speed and shadows, never realizing that the man she mocked for being slow was actually the foundation holding it all up. The power had flipped. It hadn't happened through a corporate coup or a hostile takeover. It happened through a simple, undeniable demonstration of character. The respect the men and women on that floor felt for Jack Miller, a man who would walk away from a legend status just to be a good father, was a currency Rachel Stone had never understood, and now she was bankrupt. As the Seahawk touched down in the grass field next to the elementary school, the rotors began to slow. Jack stepped out, the wind ruffling his graying hair. He saw a small figure in a bright yellow backpack running toward the fence. "Daddy!" Ellie screamed, her face lighting up with a joy that no medal or rank could ever provide. Jack knelt down, opening his arms wide. As he hugged his daughter, the lieutenant commander watched from the cockpit, realizing that the greatest expert the Navy had ever known was exactly where he was meant to be. Jack Miller didn't need a secret name to be a hero. He just needed to be Dad. The sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long golden shadows across the school parking lot. The Seahawk sat on the grass like a silent guardian, its engines ticking as they cooled. Parents who had been picking up their children stood at a distance, their phones out, capturing the sight of the grease-stained man in the oil-caked jumpsuit being saluted by a Navy officer. But to Jack, the world had narrowed down to the small, warm weight of Ellie against his chest. "Why is there a big helicopter, Daddy?" Ellie asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Did you fix it?" Jack smiled, pulling back to look at her. He reached out and gently wiped a smudge of dust from her cheek. "I helped a little bit, honey, but I'm finished now. I'm all yours." Vance stepped out of the craft one last time. He didn't approach them. He kept a respectful distance. He didn't use the call sign Aegis again. He saw the way Jack looked at his daughter, and he understood why the Navy's most brilliant engineer had chosen a life of quiet anonymity. "Sir," Vance called out softly, "the transport is waiting to take us back to the carrier. But the Admiral wanted me to give you this. He said he's been holding on to it for 5 years." He held out a small, velvet-lined box. Jack didn't want to take it, but Ellie's curiosity was piqued. She reached out and opened it. Inside sat a Navy Distinguished Service Medal. its gold surface gleaming in the twilight. Underneath the metal, engraved on the brass plate, was the name the world had forgotten: Chief Warrant Officer Jack Aegis Miller. Ellie traced the letters with her finger. Aegis? Is that your name too, Daddy? Jack looked at the metal, then at the officer, and finally at his daughter. He took the box and closed it gently. It was a name I used a long time ago, Ellie, when the world was very loud and very dangerous. But I have a better name now. What is it? She asked. Dad, he whispered. Vance nodded, offered one final slow salute, and climbed back into the Seahawk. As the rotors began to roar once more, lifting the ghost gray machine into the darkening sky, Jack and Ellie stood hand in hand, watching it go. The wind from the departure didn't feel cold anymore. It felt like a final goodbye to a past he no longer needed to carry alone. The next morning, the news of the Stone Arrow maintenance audit hit the front pages. Rachel Stone was gone, her name synonymous with corporate greed and negligence. But in a small, quiet hangar on the other side of the county, a new sign was being hung. It didn't boast of speed or efficiency. It simply read, Miller and Associates. Quality without compromise. Jack walked into his new shop at 8 a.m., not 4 a.m. He wasn't alone. Sarah and several other senior mechanics from Stone had followed him, choosing to work for the man they trusted rather than the empire they feared. The atmosphere was calm. There were no shouting matches, no ticking clocks, only the steady, focused sound of people doing work they were proud of. Jack sat at his desk, but he wasn't looking at blueprints. He was looking at a framed photo of Ellie's first day of school. His toolbox sat in the corner, cleaned and organized, a silent witness to the legend he had been and the hero he had become. He had spent his life talking to engines, listening for the secrets hidden in the roar of fire and steel. But as he listened to the quiet chatter of his team and the distant sound of a school bus, he realized the most important secret of all. True power isn't in the names the world gives you. It's in the names you choose to keep. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to Daddy Healing Stories. We believe that every dad has a secret hero inside him, and every child is the reason that hero fights. Share this video with a father who inspires you today. Remember, the world might call you by many names, but Dad is the only one that truly matters. Stay tuned for more stories that heal the soul. See you in the next one.